everybody.
Are the right to know and freedom of choice. But 75 million Americans who take vitamin
by Pepsi and its bottlers.
For all of us in just a moment. Also,
Vitamins and what else?
How many Americans die every single year because of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration? My name is Bill Falloon. I'm Vice President of the Life Extension Foundation, and we have documented more than 70 years of atrocities committed against the health of the American public by the incompetent and corrupt Food and Drug Administration. We're entering the Fda Holocaust Museum. We call it a Holocaust Museum because we have substantiated that the FDA has caused the suffering and death of millions of American citizens every single year. The FDA suppresses the truth about life-saving medications and nutrients. We can give a real easy example of that just by talking about vitamin E. Now, vitamin E was shown in the New England Journal of Medicine, May 1993, to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, specifically sudden death, heart attack, by about 40% in men and women. And yet that's not really new information. Vitamin E has been documented in thousands of studies dating back really to 1946. We have an issue of Time magazine here of 1946 that discusses the Shoup brothers' research on vitamin E and heart disease and how they were getting substantial reductions in cardiac mortality by simply giving their cardiac patients 800 IUs a day of vitamin E. Vitamin E has been known for 50 years to be a cardioprotective vitamin that reduces the risk of coronary artery disease, and yet the FDA makes it illegal for a vitamin manufacturer to promote those benefits. Vitamin E isn't the only nutrient, of course, that's been well documented. Vitamin C was documented at the University of California in Los Angeles to actually extend lifespan, human lifespan, by 6 years by simply supplementing. By people who supplemented with vitamin C dramatically reduced their risk of coronary artery disease and achieved a 6-year increase in overall lifespan. Beta-carotene has been documented in thousands of studies to be effective in preventing cell mutation, preventing the transformation of normal healthy cells into cancer cells, and yet the FDA doesn't let the truth about beta-carotene come out. And yet if you look at the scientific literature, you can find thousands, literally thousands of references showing that nutrients such as beta-carotene are highly effective in preventing cancer and heart disease. In fact, the New England Journal of Medicine studies, and some of them combined aspirin with beta-carotene, they got an even more dramatic effect in reducing overall mortality from cardiovascular disease. Coenzyme Q10 is a nutrient introduced to this country by the Life Extension Foundation in 1983. It is the most effective nutrient available in treating cardiomyopathy, congestive heart failure, and of course coronary artery disease. And yet the FDA suppresses this information by denying the companies that market coenzyme Q10 the ability to disseminate the information to the public. So only people who bother to read health magazines and newsletters learn the truth about CoQ10, and that's the minority of Americans. The majority of them simply die from a CoQ10 deficiency when the life-saving nutrient is available right in a health food store. You can't buy First Amendment aspirin from the Life Extension Foundation anymore because the FDA went to the manufacturer of this product and threatened to inspect them every single day unless they stopped making the product for us. They knew we weren't going to stop marketing it because we knew the truth and we knew we could document the truth in court. So the FDA illegally shut down the manufacturing of this particular product that we put together. It included, by the way, beta-carotene, vitamin E and vitamin C and B6. We put together a nice little package of nutrients in one pill, all fully documented to dramatically lower the risk of cardiovascular disease, specifically by inhibiting abnormal blood platelet aggregation that causes atherosclerosis and can cause a thrombotic heart attack or stroke. A lot of Americans will have died because the foundation didn't have a simple product to promote. It's easy enough just to put out an article and recommend low-dose aspirin, but it's hard to get people into the habit, especially when they're really only supposed to take about a quarter of an aspirin tablet a day, and people just aren't used to doing that. They don't perceive aspirin as a vitamin-like product like we perceive it as, in which it prevents a disease. So for the average person, they may buy a bottle of aspirin and may remember to take it, but unless they're continuously reminded, they forget. In fact, aspirin sales go up every time there's an article about its cardiovascular protective benefits, but then about 3 months later they level off to just where they were before. In other words, the public forgot. They're not taking it anymore. If the companies were able to advertise the fact, then the American public would take the low-dose aspirin and would save about 100,000 Americans every single year. The FDA has a track record of approving dangerous drugs that kill Americans. In fact, we've documented about 125,000 Americans die every single year because of FDA-approved drugs that kill. And that's why when people say, well, we need the FDA to protect us, we can expose the truth here. The fact is the FDA does not protect us against dangerous drugs. Now, I think everyone is familiar with cancer chemotherapy drugs. What we have here are a number of familiar names to any family member of a cancer patient: 5-fluorouracil, adriamycin, methotrexate. These are lethal drugs that kill cancer patients, that wipe out immune function, and for 80% of people who have cancer, they don't need to be taking these types of toxic medications, and yet the FDA approves and encourages these types of drugs to be used, and that's why the mortality rate for cancer is so high. But it's not just the chemotherapy drugs that kill Americans, it's the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs prescribed for people with chronic arthritis pain and any kind of chronic inflammation. About 7,000 Americans die every single year from this one class of drug alone. 7,000 Americans because of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Voltaren, like endomycin, like a number of drugs that you think are safe, they're only going to relieve pain and inflammation, and they make the problem worse. So we've tried to expose as many examples here of drugs that the FDA says are safe, but really kill a lot of Americans. In fact, some of these non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they're trying to get them made available for over-the-counter sale, where you won't even have physician interaction with people, and they'll be able to promote these drugs as to lay people simply to buy, and that will mean more people dying from these problems. One flagrant example of an FDA-approved drug that kills more people than it helps is the drug approved to treat AIDS, called AZT. AZT suppresses immune function. It actually kills immune system cells the same way that the HIV virus kills immune system cells. When an AIDS patient takes AZT, it speeds the progression of the disease. They die sooner because of a fraudulently approved drug that the FDA has refused to relabel or remove from the market. The result is many HIV-positive people die sooner because of a fraudulently approved FDA drug called AZT. Now, the General Accounting Office published a report in 1990 on post-approval risks of drugs that the FDA said were safe and effective. Now, that time period extended from 1976 to 1985, and what they found is that 61% of the drugs that the FDA approved had serious adverse reactions that caused these drugs to be removed from the market, relabeled with all kind of cautions, or even had to be recalled on an emergency basis. That's out of 198 new drugs the FDA approved, 102 of them had serious post-approval risks. So when people think the FDA is protecting us against dangerous and ineffective nutrients and drugs, they're not doing that. They're approving very dangerous drugs. People are dying from these drugs, and then the drugs get slowly withdrawn from the market if there's enough pressure put on the FDA. In many cases, we've documented it here, the same drugs that were killing people years ago are still being sold. The non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, the cancer chemotherapy drugs, AZT to treat AIDS, cholesterol-lowering drugs that may lower cholesterol but do serious liver damage and may even cause cancer. These drugs remain on the market, sometimes with a little bit more caution attached to them, but the FDA allows Americans to suffer and die from dangerous products. The FDA is not protecting Americans. Preventing anti-aging research is another way the FDA causes a whole lot of Americans to die unnecessarily. Most people don't know it, but the FDA has to approve a human clinical trial involving any type of new substance, even something designed to slow down the basic rate of aging. And since the FDA refuses to recognize aging as a disease, despite overwhelming documentation that aging not only is the underlying disease that causes the degenerative diseases such as heart disease, cancer, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, arthritis, the FDA says aging isn't a factor in these diseases, and we know that just isn't true. And the problem is the FDA does not allow human clinical trials on anti-aging substances, even though those substances are well documented in the peer-reviewed literature to slow the basic rate of aging. Aging is the process by which we die, and the FDA won't even recognize it as a disease. And that's why the Life Extension Foundation is documenting what can be done here to slow aging right now, and that if we simply looked at aging as a disease, which the FDA refuses to do, we could treat a lot of the incurable diseases that exist right now, and cancer is a real big one associated with aging that could be effectively treated by slowing the basic rate of aging.
There's a drug war going on you might not be aware of. A battle between the Food and Drug Administration and some people who think that agency is holding back on life-saving medication. As Health Watch reporter Dr. Steve Greenberg explains, the battleground is a new museum located in a Broward storefront.
Delaying the approval of life-saving medications is one of the easiest ways to document exactly how the FDA causes the unnecessary suffering and death of millions of Americans every single year. Now, we've documented a lot of different drugs here that the FDA has denied Americans access to that were approved in other countries first. This book, which you can buy in this country, details hundreds of drugs that are available in other countries to treat diseases that the FDA has not approved in the United States. And what that means is if you're suffering from a disease that conventional medicine is unable to effectively treat, there very well may be another drug, another therapy available in some other country, but the FDA is so slow in approving these drugs, you can't gain access to that. That could cost you your life if you have a life-threatening condition. Now, one drug that does treat life-threatening conditions is a drug called Enderol. Enderol is a prescription drug used to treat people who have a high risk for a sudden death heart attack. It inhibits abnormal heart rhythms that can cause a person to go into ventricular fibrillation. That's acute death. Now, Enderol was available in Europe for 9 years before the FDA approved it for sale in the United States. Now, cardiologists estimate that about 300,000 Americans are saved every single year because of the beta-blocking effects of drugs like Enderol. Now, if you take the 9-year delay that the FDA caused for Enderol times 300,000, you can come up with a grand total of 2.7 million dead Americans because of the FDA's delay of this one class of drugs alone. And there are many other classes of drugs the FDA is denying Americans access to. One of them is broad-spectrum antiviral drugs like ribavirin, sold under the trade name Vilona. ribavirin inhibits viral synthesis and replication. It can knock out a common cold or flu virus in 24 hours in many people, and yet the FDA does not allow that to be sold in this country. Now, for elderly people, a flu virus can be lethal. In fact, in some cases, influenza will kill 69,000 Americans in a given year if there's a real bad outbreak. Ribavirin will cure most of those cases, but you can't get it in the United States. It is available in Mexico and Europe and Japan, but the FDA has not approved ribavirin because it has a political vendetta against the company who manufactures it. That's ICN Pharmaceuticals. Another immune system boosting drug is called isoprenosine, and that works as an antiviral by enhancing your own body's immune function against the viral disease. The FDA will not approve isoprenosine because it has a political vendetta against that company that made isoprenosine and released some press reports about its benefits. That company is Newport Pharmaceuticals. They're since pretty much out of business because of the FDA ban on the sale of a very safe and effective drug that is sold all around the world. We have a number of different drugs here that are either available in other countries and not available in the United States, or are approved for different uses in other countries, because not only does the FDA ban the specific drug itself, the FDA bans the dissemination of information about other uses of that drug, like hydrogene. The FDA only allows it to be prescribed for certain conditions where there is much broader use of hydrogene in other countries. And one of those uses is preventing brain damage when a person's heart stops beating during a surgical procedure, or when an emergency situation occurs and there's no heartbeat. Paramedics in other countries will inject hydrogene. In this country, it's not approved for that use, so we wind up dying because the FDA simply hasn't approved an existing drug's use. We believe that the majority of deaths caused by the incompetent and corrupt Food and Drug Administration are a direct result of their delaying the approval of safe and effective nutrients, drugs, medical devices that have been documented in thousands of studies to work, and yet they have to meet the FDA's stringent requirements. And that means we wait, we die, while the drug sits there, not being available to our doctors, not being available for our use. We want to bring this information to the public because in some cases a person is able to actually import a medication that can result in their life being saved. And the Life Extension Foundation brings this information out on a regular basis to save lives.
Around the world and into your home, the stories that touch your life you can't afford to miss. Is the government protecting you to death?
You're so interested in your bureaucratic rules that people die.
This device detected her breast cancer, but because of the government, you can't buy it.
This product is not approved.
This pump saves lives in Europe. Here, it's illegal.
Even a life-saving device has got to have careful review.
New medical devices held up by paperwork and the system. Is it right? John Stossel's two-part expose. What's taking the bureaucrats so long to approve life-saving devices? So safe, you could die.
Sure. Faced with a dying patient and with a remedy in his medicine cabinet that might save that patient, just as that doctor can kill that patient by withholding that medicine, when FDA delays in approving new life-saving drugs and devices, it kills people. It kills the people who could have been saved by those devices.
And every time the FDA announces approval of a new wonder drug that'll save, say, 17,000 lives a year, it means that thousands died while the bureaucracy was deciding what to do.
I must admit this is an eye-opener for me, because I always thought, as I think most people do, that the FDA protects us from all kinds of dangerous things that might happen. Better to be safe than sorry.
It is better to be safe, but what is safe? Saying no to good products doesn't make life safer. And we've always reported the FDA should be doing more. It's time we hear that the FDA may be killing people by saying no.
Yeah, but suppose you're not sure. I mean, well, what can be done?
Why should there be such a ponderous bureaucracy to keep doctors from being able to make a choice? Why should it take 9 years and $2 million to get a breast pad on the market? Couldn't
Well,
they?
would you experiment?
Yes, allow things out there. The FDA could put a skull and crossbones on a product that identifies unapproved products. But doctors don't want to kill their patients. Let doctors try new technology.
And let them make the choices.
Let them make at least some informed choices. Let people have freedom over their own bodies.
Well, that is interesting, John.
The FDA denies American access to life extension and life-saving therapies. And some of these therapies are as simple as reducing the cholesterol content of your diet. In 1959, we have documented right here from the Federal Register, in 1959, the FDA made it illegal for a food company to promote low-fat, low-cholesterol foods as a way of reducing their risk of heart disease. Ads such as this that were being run, in which they stated in the ad that reducing your saturated fat intake and reducing your cholesterol intake could possibly reduce your risk of coronary artery disease, were banned. The FDA, in some cases, raided cereal companies and seized their cereal boxes if they implied that a high-fiber, low-fat diet could reduce the risk of coronary artery disease. Now, the FDA was wrong in 1959, and they carried their ignorance all the way up until about 1970 before acknowledging the role that fat and cholesterol play in the development of atherosclerosis. Now, fortunately, we've got this documentation here on the Federal Register, so we can show historically that the FDA has been wrong, dead wrong, in restricting Americans' access to even simple therapies like high-fiber, low-fat foods. Think about the complexities of drugs, and one of those drugs, frankly, is called THA. THA is now approved as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. It does slow the progression of it a little bit. It's not a miracle breakthrough, but it does have some effect. Yet in 1986, when the New England Journal of Medicine published a study documenting the benefits of THA, the FDA chose to raid the doctor's office who published the article. They said he conducted illegal human trials and that he was possibly going to be criminally prosecuted for that. Now, the doctor went through years of FDA harassment. Alzheimer's patients were denied access to THA for many, many years. It did get approved in some other countries despite the FDA censorship, but it wasn't until 1993 that the FDA finally recognized the benefits of THA and approved it for the use of treating Alzheimer's disease. The day before THA was approved, it was illegal to sell it. It was illegal for doctors to give it to patients. And the day after, the FDA says, well, now it's okay, we've approved it. It now is officially sanctioned as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Now, the Life Extension Foundation sued the FDA on this issue. We lost our lawsuit, but we did put enough pressure on them to eventually force them to recognize the value of THA as a way of slowing the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Another therapy that the FDA suppresses to Americans is Eldepril or Deprenyl. As we discussed before, Deprenyl was used in Europe in the 1960s, the 1970s, approved throughout Europe in 1982. It did not get approved in this country until 1989, and then it was only approved for single use. That's slowing the progression of Parkinson's disease. Deprenyl has a broad-spectrum anti-aging effect. Many members of the Life Extension Foundation use low-dose Deprenyl as a way of slowing the aging process, and yet the FDA doesn't recognize that. And because the FDA doesn't recognize it, most Americans do not have the ability to use Deprenyl. The doctors won't prescribe it to them. The company that makes it isn't allowed to promote the fact that Deprenyl has a wide range of benefits. As Americans, we are suffering because the FDA denies us life extension and life-saving therapies. Many of these therapies thoroughly documented in the research literature, thoroughly documented for in use, clinical use in other countries, and yet we can't have access to them. From the simple label in your cereal box to the complex drugs that affect our rate of aging, the FDA is controlling our health, and it's doing so in an extremely detrimental way. The total number of Americans dead every year as a direct result of these FDA atrocities is 1 million. That's out of the 2.4 million Americans who die every year, 1 million of them can be directly attributable to what we know the FDA is doing to suppress our access to safe therapies to prevent and treat disease. Most people don't know that the FDA regulates the water that you drink, and what the FDA tells you is that tap water is safe. The fact of the matter is tap water is very dangerous to drink on a lifelong basis. Studies have shown that people who drink tap water have 50% increases in their risk of rectal and bladder cancer. Other studies show increased rates of cancer among tap water consumers of various sites of the body. Tap water should be avoided at all costs. Now, when the first company came out with bottled water back in the 1930s, the FDA said that it was fraudulent to imply that drinking bottled water that was free of the industrial carcinogens contained in tap water was safer. The FDA spent 22 years litigating against the Capon Springs Bottled Water Company because they kept insisting that their bottled water was safer than tap water. The fact of the matter is tap water contains many known cancer-causing agents in levels far in excess of what even the government says is safe. And people should avoid drinking tap water at all costs. The foundation recommends that people use a good water filtration system or buy their water from a reliable bottled water supplier because tap water causes cancer. The FDA still denies it, but the facts are that the studies show tap water is extremely carcinogenic and should be avoided at all costs. We have a health care crisis in this country because the FDA causes the drugs and medical devices and medical procedures that we undergo to be too expensive. FDA regulation causes artificially high prices for every single aspect of medical care we need. We've given some real neat examples here. One of them deals with medication used to shrink enlarged benign prostate glands. Now, the Europeans had a drug called Permixon that was approved throughout Europe in 1982 to shrink enlarged benign prostate glands. Now, Permixon cost about $45 a month in Europe, which is pretty expensive, but it sure is a lot less expensive than undergoing surgical procedures to shrink an enlarged prostate gland or to remove an enlarged prostate gland, and it certainly is a lot more civilized. Men who undergo these procedures have urinary incontinence, and in some cases they have impotency as a result of surgeries that were unnecessary, and yet men in the United States from 1982 all the way up until 1991 did not have access to these European drugs. Now, in 1991, the FDA finally approved a drug called Proscar, which does work in a similar way as the European medication to shrink enlarged benign prostate glands. Now, Proscar costs $60 a month. That's a lot of money. The European medication is only $45 a month, but what's really shocking is you can get the identical benefit simply by taking an herbal extract, which is all Permixon really is. It's an herbal extract of the saw palmetto berry, and you can buy that in the United States for between $14 and $20 a month in a health food store. You don't even need to get a prescription for it. And if you look at the difference between what the FDA says you're allowed to have at $60 a month and what you can get in a health food store for less than a third of the price, you can see why the prices for everything we pay are artificially elevated by the FDA. They don't really have to cost that much. Now, Depronil, our favorite drug to extend lifespan and to slow the ravages of brain aging, it costs in Europe about 60 cents a tablet, yet the identical drug in the United States costs up to $2.40 a tablet. You can get it maybe for $2.20 if you really do some heavy-duty price shopping, but it's hard to get it for less than that. So we're paying about 4 times more for our Depronil than the Europeans are, and it's only because the FDA has granted an exclusive monopoly to the company who got Depronil approved in the United States. They spent a lot of millions of dollars getting it approved. They're now getting it back by charging you extortionist-like prices. This is the problem throughout the entire pharmacopoeia of drugs that we use. They cost much more in the United States than they do in other countries. And it's not just drugs, it's medical devices, it's the whole medical medical system that's regulated by an incompetent and corrupt agency called the FDA that causes this country to have a bona fide economic health care crisis. It can be resolved overnight simply by abolishing the FDA, and then all this low-cost competition can come in, and we won't have to pay 4 times more for something than what people pay in other countries for the identical drug.
He says it's a catastrophe, and people like him have been handed a death certificate. Tonight on Frontline, the decade-long story of how the AIDS virus entered this country's blood supply.
No one in government accepted the responsibility of saying, hey, we've got to do something about this.
Frontline investigates why warnings were ignored by regulators, blood banks, and doctors.
Nobody had the decency to tell us.
To tell us there was any risks involved.
You know, it's my child.
Tonight, AIDS, blood, and politics. With other independent blood banks and companies that collect blood products, it's a system that generates more than $1 billion a year. But for the last decade, it has been an industry under siege. In September of this year, a lawsuit was filed against blood product companies on behalf of 10,000 hemophiliacs who were infected with the AIDS virus through the blood supply.
There's been lies all the way down the line. And it's going to come out, hopefully with a congressional hearing, it's going to come out. And I hope the world knows the truth before I die, because I'll tell you, I've got an appointment soon to die.
It is now estimated that as many as 30,000 Americans were infected with AIDS through blood. It's a tragedy that has exposed critical weaknesses in the rules and practices of blood banking. It's also a story of missed opportunities, vested interests, and lax regulation, stretching back more than a decade to when a mysterious virus entered America's bloodstream.
Americans expect the Food and Drug Administration to protect them against dangerous drugs, to protect them against fraudulent health claims, to protect the blood supply and even the water. Now, we've shown that the FDA has not been doing that, but an area that's of acute need of protection is our blood supply. When we get a blood transfusion, we want to know that every single test was done to ensure that we're not transfused with HIV-tainted blood, with hepatitis, with a number of different diseases, and yet when you look at the facts, the FDA has utterly failed to protect the nation's blood supply. They allowed the blood banks to sell HIV-contaminated blood even after they had a test to determine if the blood was HIV positive. They simply didn't require the blood banks to do the testing for a number of years, and this is well documented in newspaper articles and books that the FDA wasn't convinced that HIV was even a transmissible disease via blood transfusions. The FDA, again, is wrong on the scientific issues, and yet they did nothing to correct the problem until enough people contracted AIDS and, of course, hepatitis through the blood supply to make the FDA pay attention. And even at this time, there are blood banks who are not following through on the medical procedures, and the FDA is ignoring the problem. One of the reasons this happens, by the way, is like with the pharmaceutical companies. When people in the FDA leave their positions, they go to work for these drug companies and make a lot of money. Well, FDA officials also go to work for the Red Cross and other blood banks, and they make a lot of money as ex-FDA officials, as advisors, consultants, board members, etc. So the FDA caters to the economic interests of the industries it regulates more so than it does to protect the health of the American public. And we believe the blood banking scandal, and we're talking about 30,000 hemophiliacs who have contracted AIDS because of the FDA's failure to properly monitor the blood bank's activities. That is an absolute criminal action. Other countries have incarcerated officials responsible for that. We believe the time will come when FDA officials will be incarcerated, along with blood banking officials who failed to recognize the risk and intentionally inflicted AIDS-tainted blood onto innocent victims. You may be wondering how the FDA can be so scientifically incorrect and economically incorrect and still maintain its power. Well, they do so at the point of a gun, just like the Gestapos did. They rule this country's healthcare system by raiding companies that don't conform to the views of the FDA. The FDA, on a regular basis, investigates, stalks out people, doctors, scientists, organizations that are promoting advanced medical therapies to reduce the risk of contracting disease, to treat disease, to slow aging. They seize everything these companies own. They will incarcerate the owners if the activity continues. The FDA rules by force, not by scientific logic. Now, the Life Extension Foundation has been at war with the FDA since 1985, and we have seen every one of their actions. We have been raided at the point of a gun, and we sued the FDA, and we won. We won our attorney's fees back when they illegally held property owned by the Life Extension Foundation longer than what they were allowed to. We're suing them on a number of other issues. But the fact of the matter is, most organizations in this country aren't willing to take the risk of having their business shut down, having their bank accounts frozen, having their owners incarcerated. They simply comply with the FDA. No matter how wrong the FDA is on the scientific issue, the companies capitulate. And that capitulation results in Americans not gaining access to safe and effective therapies to prevent disease, to safe and effective drugs that could potentially cure certain diseases. We're suffering because of the FDA's Gestapo-like powers, and those are the powers that we would like to see abolished. If the FDA didn't have the police state behind them backing them up, they would quickly dissolve because nobody would give them any credibility. Their only power is in the power of force, not in logic. And we would like to invite anyone who has viewed these tapes and seen this information to join the Life Extension Foundation to keep up to date with what we are doing to abolish the criminal activities of the Food and Drug Administration's criminal activities that are causing 1 million Americans to die every year and that are being maintained simply because the FDA has the force of the government behind it. We want to stop that, and we think we have the numbers to do it right now.